Welcome to Survival Horror Ambiance, where fear has no boundaries and every shadow hides a story. Tonight, we bring you Camp Nightmare, a tale of terror set in the heart of the woods, where troubled teens are trapped with a killer who wears a wolf mask, and the ultimate twist lies within. Before we dive into the horror, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of the madness. Now, let the nightmare begin. Chapter 1. Arrival at Camp Serenity. The bus rattled down the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the air like ghostly shrouds. Inside, a group of teenagers sat in uneasy silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The summer sun blazed overhead, but the atmosphere on the bus was anything but warm. Max stared out the window, watching the trees blur past. He was 17, teetering on the edge of adulthood, but his behavior threatened to land him in a place far worse than Camp Serenity. Juvie was the next stop if he didn't straighten up. His fingers drummed nervously on the armrest, tension in the air pressing down on him like a weight. Across the aisle, Emily clutched her journal, her lifeline to sanity. She'd been through 3 different schools in the past year, each expulsion another scar on her already fragile psyche. Her eyes flitted over the other campers, each one a mystery with a past as troubled as her own. Bus jolted to a stop and a tall figure emerged from the cabin. "All right, everyone off," barked Mr. Thompson, the camp's grizzled director. His weathered face was stern, his eyes a mix of suspicion and something darker, a shadow that hinted at his own troubled history. "Welcome to Camp Serenity. Your parents sent you here to get better, and that's exactly what's going to happen." One by one, the teens shuffled off the bus, squinting against the bright sunlight. They grabbed their bags and followed Mr. Thompson toward the main lodge, a rustic building that looked like it had seen better days. Camp Serenity was deep in the woods of Cortland, New York, miles from the nearest town. Isolation was part of the program, designed to cut them off from their old lives and force them to confront their issues head-on. Max hefted his duffel bag over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the campgrounds. The cabins were spread out in a semicircle around a large fire pit, and beyond that lay the dark expanse of the forest. An unsettling feeling gnawed at him, something he couldn't quite shake. Mr. Thompson led them into the lodge, where a group of counselors waited. "This is your home for the next 8 weeks, he announced. "We'll be working together on trust exercises, group therapy, and activities designed to help you all grow and heal." The teens exchanged skeptical glances. Trust wasn't something that came easily to any of them. As they were assigned their cabins and roommates, reality of their situation began to sink in. They were stuck here, whether they liked it or not. Later that night, as the campers gathered around the fire pit for their first meeting, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp. Mr. Thompson introduced the counselors, each with their own troubled pasts and redemption stories. But it was Mr. Thompson's own story that caught Max's attention. "Years ago," Mr. Thompson began, his voice rough but steady, "I wasn't much different from you kids. Trouble found me everywhere I went, and I found ways to make it worse. I came to a place like this, and it turned my life around." His eyes flickered with something unsaid, a shadow of a memory too dark to share. "That's why I started Camp Serenity, to give you all the chance I had." He didn't elaborate, leaving the details shrouded in mystery. Max couldn't help but wonder what kind of trouble Mr. Thompson had been in, what kind of demons he still carried. The director's past was like the forest surrounding them, dark, deep, and full of secrets. Max tried to listen, but his mind kept drifting. The woods seemed to close in around them, the darkness swallowing the light from the fire. He looked around at the faces of his fellow campers, wondering if any of them felt the same sense of foreboding. In the flickering light, Emily scribbled in her journal, her eyes darting up every few seconds. She, too, felt the unease, the sense that they were being watched. She wrote down her thoughts, trying to make sense of the growing dread in her chest. As the fire crackled and the night grew darker, Mr. Thompson's voice broke through the silence. "Remember, we're here to help each other. Trust is the key to your success here at Camp Serenity." Max glanced at Emily, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. They both knew that trust was going to be hard to come by. And as the night stretched on, The shadows deepened, hiding secrets that none of them could yet imagine. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Flames. The campfire crackled and hissed as the flames danced, casting eerie shadows across the faces of the campers huddled around it. The night was cool, the sky a deep, inky black, dotted with stars. The woods surrounding Camp Serenity were silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Fire was the only source of light, flickering beacon in the darkness. Max sat cross-legged on the ground, the warmth of the fire a welcome contrast to the chill creeping through the air. He glanced around the circle, noting the tension in the group. The day's strange events had left everyone on edge, and now, as night closed in, that unease had only grown stronger. Mr. Thompson, seated on a log near the fire, clapped his hands to get everyone's attention. "All right, everyone," said, his voice steady and calm. "It's time for some campfire stories." There was a moment of hesitation, campers exchanging glances. Finally, Alex, ever the attention seeker, leaned forward with a smug grin. "I'll start," he said, his voice dripping with confidence. "All right, Alex, go ahead," Mr. Thompson said, giving him the floor. Alex cleared his throat dramatically. "So, there was this guy, right? A hitchhiker. He was just minding his own business, trying to get a ride home one night. It was pouring rain, middle of nowhere. This car pulls up real nice, fancy even. Guy thinks he's hit the jackpot. But when he gets in, driver's face is all messed up. Like half of it's melted off or something. The hitchhiker is freaked out but doesn't say anything. Just stares out the window. Then the driver turns to him and says, 'You know why I look like this? Because I didn't pick you up.'" Alex paused for effect, his grin widening. The hitchhiker wakes up in a ditch, car's gone, but he's got blood on his hands and the driver's face staring up at him from the mud. There were a few nervous laughs, but the story didn't have quite the impact Alex had hoped. Max rolled his eyes, unimpressed. "Nice try, Alex," Lisa said with a smirk, "but I've got a better one." Alex scowled, leaned back, crossing his arms as Lisa took over. "Okay, so there's this girl," Lisa began, her tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She's home alone, right? Her parents are out of town for the weekend. She's sitting in her room just reading a book when she hears this tapping sound on her window. She thinks it's just the wind, ignores it. But the tapping keeps getting louder. Finally, she looks out the window, and there's nothing there. But the tapping doesn't stop, coming from inside her closet. She gets up, heart racing, opens the closet door, and there's this old creepy doll sitting on the shelf. She didn't put it there, but the doll's eyes are open and they're staring right at her. She freaks out, slams the door shut, and runs to her parents' room, locks the door. But when she turns around, the doll is sitting on the bed, still staring at her. Lisa paused, letting the tension build. They found her the next morning, still in the room, eyes wide open. She's completely catatonic, couldn't speak a word for the rest of her life. Campers were silent for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Max noticed Jesse shifting uncomfortably, his eyes darting around as if expecting the doll to appear in the darkness. Next, Matt chimed in, his voice taking on a low, serious tone. "There's a legend around here, old man who used to live in these woods. People say he went crazy after his family died in a fire. They say he started hearing voices, seeing things that weren't there. He built a cabin deep in the forest, away from everyone, and people in town started disappearing. They found his cabin years later, all boarded up. The walls inside were covered in claw marks. No one knows what happened to him. But they say if you go into the woods at night, you can still hear him screaming for his family." A shiver ran down Max's spine, story striking a nerve. The atmosphere around the fire grew heavier, the shadows seeming to creep closer. Mr. Thompson glanced at Emily, who had been silent until now, her journal closed and resting on her lap. "Emily, you got one for us?" Emily looked up, her eyes reflecting the firelight. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I've got one." The campers leaned in, sensing that this one would be different. Emily's voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried through the night with an intensity that demanded attention. "There's a story my grandmother used to tell me," Emily began, voice steady, "about a killer in these parts. They called him the Wolfman. He wasn't really a man, not anymore. They said he wore a mask made from a wolf's head, fur matted with blood. He lived in the woods, and at night, he'd come out to hunt. He didn't kill just anyone, though. He had a way of knowing who had secrets, who had done something wrong. He'd stalk them, watching from the shadows, and when the time was right, strike. Emily paused, her eyes scanning the faces of the campers, each one captivated by her words. People say he was never caught. The police found his victims, but never him. Some think he's still out there in the woods waiting, watching. And when the moon is full, that's when he's most dangerous. That's when he hunts. The silence that followed was thick with fear, each camper glancing nervously into the darkness beyond the fire's glow. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, flames licking at the night as if trying to ward off the shadows that seemed to press in closer. Max felt a chill run down his spine, the unease from earlier in the day now magnified by Emily's haunting tale. He knew it was just a story, something to scare them. The way Emily had told it, there was something too real about it, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. All right, I think that's enough for tonight. Let's get some rest. We've got a big day tomorrow. Campers slowly dispersed, the earlier camaraderie replaced by a lingering sense of dread. Max stayed by the fire for a moment longer, staring into the flames as if trying to burn away the images Emily's story had conjured in his mind. As he made his way back to the cabin, the night seemed darker than before, the shadows deeper, the silence more oppressive. And as he lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, Max couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the woods that surrounded them, something was watching. Chapter 4. The Search. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground, as the campers gathered outside their cabins. Previous night's stories lingered in the back of their minds, but today's task was something more immediate, something real. Mr. Thompson had decided it was time to inspect the cabin. The missing items had caused enough tension, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. Max stood off to the side, his hands shoved into his pockets as he watched Mr. Thompson and the other counselors move from cabin to cabin. There was a nervous energy in the air, campers exchanging wary glances as the inspection drew closer to their own spaces. As they reached Alex's cabin, there was a palpable shift. Max noticed Alex stiffen, his usual bravado faltering for just a moment. Counselors entered the cabin, and after a few minutes of silence, there was a shout. "Mr. Thompson, you need to see this." The campers crowded around the entrance as Mr. Thompson stepped inside. A tense silence fell over the group as the counselor emerged, holding up a bundle of the missing items: watches, wallets, a flashlight, all things that had vanished over the past few days. Mr. Thompson's face was stern as he looked at Alex. "We need to talk, Alex." Alex's face turned a shade paler, his usual smirk completely gone. He opened his mouth to say something, but seemed to think better of it, clenching his jaw instead. The other campers immediately began whispering among themselves, the sound like a swarm of bees. Max could feel the tension rising, the atmosphere thick with judgment. Jesse shot a glance at Alex, but there was no sympathy in it, just a mix of relief and disdain. Lisa, standing close to Jesse, shook her head in disappointment. Mr. Thompson led Alex away from the group, the other campers watching him with a mix of suspicion and anger. No one said a word, but the message was clear. Alex had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to be forgiven easily. Later, as the campers went about their daily activities, Max couldn't shake the image of Alex's defeated expression. Despite everything, there was a part of him that felt uneasy about the whole situation. Alex was a bully, sure, but something about this didn't sit right. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Mr. Thompson found Alex sitting alone by the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the colors of the sky. There was a heaviness in the air. Mr. Thompson approached quietly, taking a seat next to Alex. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out between them. Finally, Mr. Thompson broke the silence. "Alex, I want you to know something. Despite what's happened, I still believe in you." Alex stared out at the water, his expression unreadable. "Everyone else thinks I'm a thief. Well, maybe I am." Mr. Thompson shook his head. "I've been doing this a long time, Alex. I've seen a lot of kids come through this camp. And I know when someone's made a mistake versus when someone's lost their way completely. You're not lost yet. But you need to make a choice, to take responsibility, to make things right. Alex's eyes narrowed as he continued to look out at the lake. And what if I can't? You can, Mr. Thompson said firmly, but it's up to you. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the gentle lapping of the water the only sound. Then, without another word, Alex stood up and walked away, leaving Mr. Thompson alone by the lake. That night, as the campers settled into their cabins, strange unease settled over the camp. Max couldn't sleep, tossing and turning as his mind raced with thoughts of Alex, the stolen items, and the conversation he'd overheard by the lake. Something wasn't right. When the morning came, the camp was thrown into chaos. Alex was gone. His bed was untouched, his things still in the cabin, but there was no sign of him anywhere. Panic quickly spread as the counselors and campers realized he was missing. Mr. Thompson quickly organized a search party, dividing the campers and counselors into groups to comb the woods and surrounding area. Max found himself in a group with Jesse and Lisa, the tension between them forgotten in the face of something more serious. As they moved through the woods, calling out Alex's name, Max couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds their voices and the crunch of leaves underfoot. The search dragged on, the sun climbing higher in the sky as the hours passed. Max's voice grew hoarse from calling out, his anxiety mounting with each passing minute. But as the sun began to set once again, casting long shadows through the trees, there was still no sign of Alex. The groups began to reconvene at the camp, their faces etched with worry and fear. Mr. Thompson stood at the edge of the clearing, his expression grim as he surveyed the returning searchers. Max could see the worry in his eyes, the same worry that gnawed at his own stomach. As the last of the groups returned, empty-handed and exhausted, Mr. Thompson called off the search for the night. Campers dispersed, some heading to their cabins, others lingering by the fire, whispering in hushed tones. Max sat down heavily on a log near the fire, mind racing. The unease from the day before had only grown, and now it was something more, gnawing fear that something terrible was about to happen. As the night closed in around them, the camp was plunged into a tense, uneasy silence, and somewhere out there in the darkness was Alex, alone, scared, and possibly in danger. The question that weighed on everyone's mind, though, was what kind of danger that might be. Chapter 5: The Warning. The air in the dinner hall was thick with tension. The usual hum of chatter was absent, replaced by a nervous silence as the campers filed in for the evening meal. Tables were set, but no one seemed eager to eat. All eyes were on the entrance, where Mr. Thompson stood with a man in a sheriff's uniform. Max watched from the back of the room, his stomach churning. Jesse, sitting beside him, seemed oblivious to the tension, already picking at the food on his tray. Max couldn't understand how he could eat with everything going on, but Jesse had always been the type to focus on what was in front of him. The sheriff cleared his throat, and the murmur of conversation died down completely. He was a tall, weathered man with a face that looked like it had seen more than its fair share of trouble. His name tag read, Sheriff Collins, and his gaze swept over the room, taking in the worried faces of the campers and counselors. "Evening, everyone," Sheriff Collins began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "I know you've all had a rough day, and I'm not here to make it any harder on you. But as you're all aware, one of your own is missing, Alex. We've been out there searching, and I'm going to be blunt with you. Any information you might have, anything you've seen or heard, could be crucial in helping us find him." The sheriff paused, letting his words sink in. "If you've noticed anything unusual, something Alex said or did, anything at all, now's the time to speak up. We're all hoping for the best, but time is of the essence." Max shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He thought back to the conversation he'd overheard between Alex and Mr. Thompson by the lake. Had there been something in Alex's voice, something that hinted at what he was planning? But before he could dwell on it, he was distracted by the sound of Jesse munching on a piece of bread, completely absorbed in his meal. Sheriff Collins continued, "I don't want to alarm anyone, but there's a storm coming in tonight. That's going to make the search harder. So if you remember anything, even after we've wrapped up here, don't hesitate to tell one of the counselors or come find me directly." The sheriff's words hung in the air like the heavy clouds outside. The storm had been gathering all afternoon, and now the wind was starting to pick up, rustling the trees and making the dinner hall creak ominously. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his expression serious. "All right, everyone. Let's stay calm and focused. We'll get through this together. If you think of anything, no matter how small, please come to me or one of the other counselors." With that, Sheriff Collins nodded and turned to leave, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The tension in the room didn't break until the door closed behind him, the wind howling briefly before it was shut out. As the sheriff's car rumbled to life outside, Max finally turned to Jesse. "How can you eat at a time like this?" Jesse looked up, surprised. "What do you mean? We're gonna need our strength, right? Might as well eat while we can." Max shook his head, unable to argue. Jesse had a way of cutting through the worry, focusing on what was right in front of him. It was a skill, Max supposed, but one he couldn't muster. The wind picked up outside, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the windows. The storm was closing in, and with it came an unease that seeped into every corner of the camp. The campers ate in near silence, the only sound the occasional clatter of a fork or the low rumble of thunder in the distance. As the night wore on, the storm would bring more than just rain and wind. The search for Alex would continue, but the sense of foreboding that had settled over Camp Nightmare was here to stay. And as the lightning flashed outside, illuminating the dark woods, Max couldn't help but feel that they were all on the edge of something far more dangerous than a missing camper. Chapter 6: The Storm's Wrath. The storm had fully descended on camp, turning the evening into a chaotic symphony of wind and rain. Cabins creaked under the pressure, and the trees outside bent and groaned as if they might snap at any moment. Max sat on his bed, staring at the window, watching the rain pelt the glass in a relentless barrage. He couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was a reflection of something darker brewing within the camp. A knock on the door pulled Max from his thoughts. It was Mr. Thompson, his face drawn with concern. He stepped into the cabin, closing the door behind him to muffle the howling wind outside. "Mind if I sit?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice carrying a weariness that Max hadn't noticed before. Max nodded, and Mr. Thompson lowered himself onto the edge of the bed opposite Max. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the steady drum of rain on the roof. "Max," Mr. Thompson began, his tone gentle but firm, "I wanted to talk to you about Alec." Max tensed at the mention of his missing friend. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about him since the sheriff's visit. Mr. Thompson continued, "I know things haven't been easy for you here, and I know you and Alex had your differences, but I want you to understand that this camp, it's not just about keeping you out of trouble. It's about giving you a chance to make the right choices, to avoid the kind of mistakes that can ruin your life." Max looked down at his hands, his mind flashing to the fights, trouble with the law, the constant feeling of being one wrong step away from a path he didn't want to go down. "Alex," Mr. Thompson said, "he's a good kid at heart, but like you, he's on a dangerous path. I'm worried about him, Max. I'm worried about all of you. This camp, it's my last chance to help save as many of you as I can before it's too late." Max felt a lump form in his throat. He'd always seen Mr. Thompson as just another authority figure, someone who couldn't possibly understand what it was like to be 17 and angry at the world. But hearing the concern in his voice, seeing the lines of worry etched into his face, made Max realize that maybe Mr. Thompson cared more than he let on. Before Max could respond, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night, cutting through the storm like a knife. Both Max and Mr. Thompson froze, their eyes meeting in an instant of shared dread. Without a word, they bolted from the cabin, sprinting through the rain-soaked campgrounds toward the source of the scream. The other campers and counselors had heard it too, and they emerged from their cabins, some clutching flashlights, others just standing in the downpour, wide-eyed and terrified. The scream had come from Jesse's cabin. Max's heart pounded in his chest as he and Mr. Thompson pushed through the crowd that had gathered at the door of the cabin. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. Inside, it was dark, save for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the interior in brief, horrific bursts. Mr. Thompson was the first to step inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The light fell on something on the floor, and Max felt his stomach lurch. Jesse lay there, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, blood pooling around him, his face frozen in an expression of sheer terror. Gasps and cries of horror erupted from the campers crowded around the door. Someone shouted, "It's Alex! He's gone crazy!" Max stumbled back, his mind reeling. Jesse had been butchered, his body torn apart in a way that was almost inhuman. The sight was too much to process, and he found himself retching in the grass outside. Mr. Thompson, pale and shaken, tried to regain control of the situation. "Everyone, stay calm. We don't know what happened here, but panicking won't help. We need to stay together and figure this out." But the campers were already in a state of panic. The accusation had been thrown out there, and now everyone was looking at each other with suspicion and fear. The rain fell harder and the wind howled louder, as if the storm itself was feeding off the chaos. Just then, one of the counselors came running up, out of breath. "The phones," she panted. "The phone lines have been cut. And the cell phones, the ones we collected, they're all missing." Mr. Thompson's face tightened. "What about the radios, the emergency signal?" "Gone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something's jamming the signal." A sense of dread settled over the camp like a heavy fog. They were isolated, cut off from the outside world, with no way to call for help and a killer potentially lurking among them. The storm raged on, but it was the fear in the eyes of the campers that truly terrified Max. As Mr. Thompson tried to rally the group, Max's thoughts spiraled. Was it really Alex? Had his friend lost it completely, driven to madness by whatever demons he was battling? Or was something else at play? Something darker and more sinister. The night stretched on, the storm showing no signs of letting up, and somewhere in the darkness, the truth about what happened to Jesse and what was still to come remained hidden, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 7. The Wolf at the Door. The storm outside showed no signs of relenting. The wind whipped through the trees, making them creak ominously, and the rain fell in sheets, drenching everything in sight. Mr. Thompson, drenched from the sprint across the campgrounds, locked the door to Jesse's cabin with a grim expression. Crime scene needed to be preserved. More importantly, he needed to get the rest of the campers to safety. With a deep breath, he turned and began herding the remaining campers and counselors toward the main lodge. The air was thick with fear and confusion, and the storm's fury only heightened the sense of impending doom that hung over them all. Once inside the lodge, Mr. Thompson slammed the heavy wooden door shut, bolting it securely. "All right, everyone, listen up." Mr. Thompson's voice cut through the anxious murmuring. "We're going to stay here until the storm passes and we can figure out what's going on. No one leaves this building, understood?" The campers huddled together in small groups nodded, their faces pale with fear. The lodge, normally a place of laughter and warmth, now felt cold and foreboding. The windows rattled with each gust of wind, and the flickering lanterns cast long, eerie shadows on the walls. Mr. Thompson began counting heads, his brow furrowing as he mentally ticked off names. He stopped abruptly, heart skipping a beat. "Has anyone seen Matt?" he asked, his voice rising in concern. The question sent a ripple of panic through the room. Everyone looked around, as if expecting Matt to appear out of thin air. But he didn't. Emily, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, scribbling furiously in her notebook, looked up at the mention of Matt's name. Her hand paused, but only for a moment, before she continued writing with even more fervor. "Matt?" Mr. Thompson called out again, his voice echoing in the lodge. There was no response. The storm seemed to grow louder, as if mocking their efforts to find some semblance of order amidst the chaos. Suddenly, the door to the lodge burst open with a deafening crash. Everyone screamed, instinctively backing away as the door slammed against the wall. A figure stumbled inside, drenched and wild-eyed. It was Matt. He was gasping for breath, clothes torn and muddy, his face a mask of sheer terror. "He's out there!" Matt shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. "He's out there with an axe, a man in a wolf mask. He's coming for us!" The room erupted into chaos. Campers screamed, some crying, others clutching each other in fear. Mr. Thompson rushed to Matt's side, trying to calm him down. Matt was beyond reason. He was shaking uncontrollably, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting the masked man to appear at any moment. "Matt, listen to me. Mr. Thompson said, gripping Matt by the shoulders. "You're safe now. We're all safe here." But Matt shook his head violently. "No, we're not. He's coming. I saw him. He was right behind me." Voice cracked as he spoke, his fear infecting everyone in the room. Emily's writing had become frantic, her pen moving so fast it was a blur. Face was pale, her eyes wide as she scribbled down every word, every detail of the horror unfolding around her. It was as if she were trying to capture it all, to make sense of the madness through the only means she had. As Mr. Thompson tried to console Matt, the lodge was suddenly plunged into darkness. The lanterns flickered out, leaving them in pitch blackness. A collective gasp rose from the group, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving outside. The room fell silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of the terrified campers. Then, cutting through the storm's roar, a voice echoed through the darkness. It was low, distorted, and filled with malice. Little pig, let me in." The voice sent chills down everyone's spine. It was a twisted parody of a children's rhyme. There was nothing playful about it. The voice was modulated as if coming through a cheap speaker, but it was close, too close. Panic surged through the group. Mr. Thompson frantically searched for something, anything, to secure the door, but the voice came again, this time louder, closer. Little pig, let me in." Chapter 8. The Invitation. The lodge was thick with tension, the silence almost unbearable as the storm raged outside. The campers and counselors huddled together, their fear palpable. The only sound was the wind howling through the trees, punctuated by the occasional crack of thunder. The modulated voice that had chilled them to their core moments ago seemed to hang in the air, a sinister reminder that they were not alone. Suddenly, one of the campers, Travis, tall, muscular boy with a reputation for being a hothead, couldn't take it anymore. He pushed his way to the front of the group, his face twisted in anger and fear. "Come right in, motherfucker," Travis shouted, his voice trembling with a mix of bravado and desperation. There was a moment of stunned silence as everyone stared at him, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. Then, as if in response, a low, guttural laugh echoed through the lodge. It was the same modulated voice, but this time it carried a hint of amusement, dark satisfaction. Before anyone could react, there was a loud, splintering crash as an axe slammed into the heavy wooden door. Force of the blow sent shockwaves through the lodge. The campers screamed, some backing away, others frozen in place. The axe struck again, splintering the wood further, but then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the attack stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. For a moment, no one moved. Mr. Thompson, his heart pounding in his chest, motioned for everyone to stay back. He approached the door cautiously, expecting the next blow to come at any moment. There was nothing, no sound, no movement. The man in the wolf mask had vanished into the storm. "What the hell are we going to do now?" one of the counselors, Derek, asked, his voice shaky as he glanced around at the terrified faces. "We can't stay here," Emily shouted, clutching her notebook tightly to her chest. "He's playing with us. We don't even know where he is," said Lisa, her voice quivering. "It could be anywhere. It could be right outside, waiting," Max said darkly. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the room. "Or he could already be in here." "Enough," Mr. Thompson barked, trying to regain control of the situation. "We need to stay calm and think. We can't let him scare us into doing something stupid." But before anyone could respond, a loud crash shattered the fragile calm. The sound of breaking glass filled the air as the body of the sheriff came flying through one of the lodge's large windows. Storm's fury rushed in with him, rain and wind whipping through the room, sending papers and debris flying. Screams erupted as the campers scrambled away from the broken window. The sheriff's lifeless body lay crumpled on the floor, his face frozen in a grimace of terror. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the wooden floorboard. "Thanks for the invite," the modulated voice drawled, dripping with cruel amusement. The man in the wolf mask stepped through the shattered window, a storm swirling around him like an unholy aura. The mask was grotesque, matted fur and wild, glassy eyes that seemed to reflect the fear in the room. He held the axe in one hand, the blade still wet with rain, and in the other, he brandished the sheriff's gun, taken from the corpse at his feet. Travis, fueled by a mix of rage and adrenaline, made a move to charge at the masked figure. "I'll kill you," he screamed, his voice raw with emotion. But before he could get close, the wolfman raised the gun and fired. The shot rang out like thunder, and Travis's body jerked violently before crumpling to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. The room erupted into chaos as the remaining campers and counselors screamed and scattered in every direction, trying to find some place, any place, to hide from the nightmare that had descended upon them. "Run, run, little piggies," the wolfman called after them, his voice taunting, brutal. "But you can't hide from the big bad wolf." Mr. Thompson, his heart racing, grabbed Max by the arm and dragged him toward the back of the lodge. "We need to get out of here, now," he shouted over the storm, his voice barely audible above the wind and rain. Chapter 9. Into the Darkness. The storm's fury had become almost unbearable as the group fled the lodge, the wind and rain slashing at their faces like icy whips. The campers and counselors scattered in every direction, driven by blind panic and the primal urge to survive. Thunder rolled overhead, drowning out the terrified screams and the crashing of branches. They pushed through the dense woods. Max, Emily, and Lisa found themselves running together, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they sprinted through the downpour. Mr. Thompson was just ahead of them, his face set in a grim mask of determination as he led them toward one of the vacant cabins on the far side of the camp. They had no plan, no sense of where to go or what to do, only the desperate need to escape the nightmare that had descended upon them. "We have to keep moving," Mr. Thompson shouted over the howling wind, glancing back at the three teens. "We can't let him catch us." "I can't," Lisa gasped, stumbling over a tree root, her legs burning with exhaustion. "I can't keep up." "You have to, Lisa," Max urged, grabbing her arm to steady her. "We're almost there." Emily was silent, her eyes wide with fear as she clutched her notebook to her chest. She could feel the presence of the killer, the man in the wolf mask, looming behind them, his shadow a dark stain on the edges of her vision. She didn't dare look back, didn't dare confirm the terror she knew was closing in on them. Cabin loomed ahead, dark silhouette against the raging storm. It was one of the older cabins, long since abandoned and left to decay. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking ominously as it swayed in the wind. "There!" Mr. Thompson yelled, pointing to the cabin. "We can hide in there." They reached the door and stumbled inside, collapsing onto the dusty floor. The inside of the cabin was pitch black, the only light coming from the flashes of lightning that illuminated the room in brief, blinding bursts. The air was thick with the smell of mold and damp wood, and the sound of the storm was almost deafening as it battered the walls. "We need to barricade the door," Mr. Thompson said, his voice tight with urgency. "Help me find something to block it." Max and Emily scrambled to their feet, searching the dark cabin for anything they could use. They found an old wooden table and a few chairs, dragging them to the door and piling them up in front of it. The door creaked ominously under the strain, but it held for the moment. "Is everyone okay?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice shaking as he tried to catch his breath. I think so," Emily stammered, her heart pounding in her chest. But as the adrenaline began to wear off, they realized someone was missing. "Lisa!" Max called out, his voice tinged with panic as he turned to look for her. "Lisa!" Emily echoed, her voice rising with fear. They heard a soft moan from the corner of the cabin, where Lisa had collapsed, clutching her side. "I tripped," she said weakly, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I think I twisted my ankle." Max rushed to her side, but before he could help her up, the door shattered violently as something heavy slammed against it. The killer had found them. "Get away from the door," Mr. Thompson yelled, pulling Max back. The axe blade suddenly burst through the wood, splintering it with terrifying force. The door wouldn't hold much longer. "We have to get out of here," Emily cried, her voice shaking as she clutched her notebook tighter, as if it could somehow protect her. "Lisa, come on," Max urged, trying to help her to her feet. But it was too late. The door gave way with a splintering crash, and the man in the wolf mask stood there, his eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. He raised the axe, its blade glinting in the lightning's flash. "Run!" Mr. Thompson shouted, trying to shield the teens. But the killer was too fast. He swung the axe down with brutal force, and before anyone could react, the blade struck Lisa, a sickening thud as it connected with her flesh. "No!" Max screamed, reaching out for her, but the killer grabbed Lisa by the leg and began dragging her out of the cabin, her screams piercing the night. "Let her go, you bastard," Mr. Thompson roared, rushing forward, but the killer only laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the storm. He dragged Lisa out into the darkness, her screams growing fainter until they were swallowed by the wind. Max stood frozen, his mind unable to process what had just happened. Could still hear Lisa's voice, the way she had screamed his name as she was pulled away. He had been so close to saving her, and now she was gone. Emily's voice snapped him back to reality. He was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "We have to go. He'll come back for us." Mr. Thompson, his face pale and drawn, nodded in agreement. "We need to get to the others. We can't stay here." The three of them scrambled out of the cabin, the storm still raging around them. They had no idea where to go or what to do, only that they had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of the killer who was now hunting them. As they ran through the woods, the wind howling in their ears, Max couldn't shake the image of Lisa being dragged away. Terror, helplessness, was all-consuming, and he knew, deep down, that this was far from over. Somewhere in the darkness, the man in the wolf mask was watching them, waiting for his next move. The hunt was still on, and now they were more vulnerable than ever. Chapter 10. The Rage Within. The rain pounded down, each drop like a needle piercing Max's skin. It mingled with the sweat and tears on his face. The sting was nothing compared to the fire burning inside him. They ran through the woods, branches whipping at their clothes, the storm raging all around them. But Max's mind was elsewhere, lost in memories he had tried so hard to bury. Lisa's screams echoed in his ears, haunting him with every step. He could still see her terrified face, the way her hand had reached out to him, desperate and pleading. He had failed her. She was gone, dragged away into the darkness by that monster, and it was all his fault. A cold rage began to swell within him, mixing with the fear and guilt until it threatened to consume him. He hadn't felt this way since the incident that had landed him in this hellhole in the first place. His thoughts drifted back to that day, to the moment that had changed everything. It was the last day of school, and the bully had been at it again, taunting him like always. But that day, the kid had crossed a line, one Max couldn't forgive. He had mocked his mother, the one person Max had loved more than anything in this world, the one person who had been taken from him too soon. The words had cut deep, reopening wounds that had never really healed. Something inside Max had snapped. He had seen red, his vision blurring as the rage took over. He had pounded that kid with everything he had, his fists slamming into flesh and bone until they were slick with blood. He hadn't stopped, couldn't stop, until the teachers had pulled him away, the boy's face a broken mess beneath him. Max had almost killed him, and a part of him hadn't cared. That's what had gotten him sent to camp, the place where they sent kids like him to be fixed. But no camp could fix what was broken inside him. No camp could erase the pain or the anger that had festered for years. Now that rage was back, stronger than ever, demanding to be unleashed. Lisa had been the first person he had let himself care about since his mother died. She was sweet, kind in a way that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be alone anymore. But now she was gone, ripped away from him by that masked bastard. And Max wasn't going to let that go. Not this time. He wiped the rain from his eyes, his face flushed with anger, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel it, his primal need to do something, to strike back, to make the man in the wolf mask pay for what he had done. The image of the axe slicing into Lisa's flesh, the sound of her screams, it all played on a loop in his mind, fueling the inferno inside him. Mr. Thompson called out to him, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Max, we need to keep moving. We can't stay out here." But Max barely heard him. His thoughts were focused on one thing: vengeance. Didn't care about the consequences, didn't care about anything, except making that monster suffer the way Lisa had suffered. He clenched his fists, feeling the muscles in his arms tighten, the familiar burn of rage coursing through him. "We have to find the others," Mr. Thompson urged, grabbing Max's arm to get his attention. Max turned to look at him, his eyes blazing with a determination that was almost frightening. "No," he said, his voice low and fierce. "We're going to kill him." Thompson's eyes widened in surprise. "Max, you're not thinking straight. We need to get to safety, to regroup." "There's no safety," Max snapped, his voice trembling with anger. "Not until he's dead. He took Lisa, and I'm not going to let him get away with it." Mr. Thompson hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to protect Max and recognizing the fire in his eyes. He knew there was no stopping him. Max took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. But it was no use. Rage was too strong, too powerful to ignore. It demanded action. "We need to get to the lounge," he said finally, his voice cold and resolved. "We need weapons, and then we're going after him." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, seeing the resolve in Max's eyes. "Okay," he said, though his voice was heavy with concern. "But we do this together. No one else is dying tonight." Max nodded, but inside he made a promise to himself. He would be the one to end this. He would find the man in the wolf mask, and he would make him pay for what he had done to Lisa. He wouldn't let fear or doubt stop him. Next time he saw that mask, it would be the last. As they began to make their way toward the lounge, the storm still raging around them, Max felt something shift inside him. He wasn't the scared kid who had been sent to this camp anymore. He was something else now, something dangerous. And he wouldn't stop until justice was served, no matter what it took. Chapter 11. The trap is set. The storm raged on, battering the windows of the lounge as Max finished setting the last of his traps. His hands were steady, his mind focused on one thing: taking down the man in the wolf mat. Killer had taken too much from them already. Lisa, Jesse, and now Alex, who had been dragged into the night and left for dead. Max was determined not to lose anyone else. Mr. Thompson watched Max with a mix of concern and admiration. He could see the fire in the boy's eyes, the same fire that had once led Max down a dangerous path, but was now driving him to protect those he cared about. He wanted to reach out, offer some words of wisdom or comfort, but he knew this wasn't the time. All they could do was prepare. As they finished setting up, the door to the lounge suddenly burst open, slamming against the wall. Max tensed, expecting the worst, but instead of the wolf-masked killer, it was Alex, staggering inside, drenched and bleeding. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Alex!" Max shouted, rushing to his side. The boy collapsed into Max's arms, clutching his side where blood oozed from a deep gash. He'd managed to escape, but barely. "They left me. Thought I was dead," Alex gasped, voice weak. "But I heard them. I know who it is." Before Alex could say more, the door slammed open again, and there stood the man in the wolf mask, soaked from the storm, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. He stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. Max didn't hesitate. He launched himself at the killer, aiming a makeshift spear at his chest. The wolf mask man sidestepped with frightening speed, the spear grazing his side but failing to slow him down. The killer responded with a brutal swing of his axe, forcing Max to dive out of the way. Thompson had already moved to shield Alex, who had fallen unconscious again, the blood loss too much for him to bear. The killer seemed to hesitate for a moment, his gaze flickering to Alex. Max saw the opportunity and took it, lunging forward to tackle the man. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, the axe skidding across the room. Max swung his fists with all the strength he could muster, landing blow after blow on the killer's masked face. The wolf mask man grunted in pain, but managed to throw Max off him with a powerful shove. As Max scrambled to his feet, he noticed the killer reaching for a hidden holster under his jacket. "Die," killer muttered, pulling out a gun. Before he could aim, Max grabbed a nearby arrow from his makeshift quiver and with a swift motion, shot it straight at the killer's arm. The arrow struck true, forcing the man to drop the gun with a pained growl. Max didn't stop there. He shot another arrow, this time hitting the killer's leg, bringing him to his knees. The sight of the wolf mask man struggling to stay upright fueled Max's rage. He tossed aside his bow and lunged forward, fists clenched. Max's punches came down like hammers, each one fueled by the anger and pain of the last few days. The killer's mask cracked under the assault, but Max didn't care. He kept hitting, his vision red with fury. All he could think about was Lisa, Jesse, and Alex. He wasn't going to stop until the man in the wolf mask was nothing but a broken, bloodied heap. But then, just as victory seemed assured, Max felt a sharp, searing pain in his back. He gasped, stumbling forward as his strength left him. He turned around slowly, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Standing there, smiling wickedly, was Emily. In her hand was a bloody knife, still dripping with Max's blood. "God damn it, Johnny," Emily said, her voice laced with mockery. "If you want something done right, you have to do it yourself." Max's vision blurred as he tried to make sense of it all. Emily? How could she? Before he could finish the thought, the world went black. Mr. Thompson, who had been struggling to help Alex, froze in shock. "Emily, what have you done?" Emily ignored him. Her attention focused on the wolf-masked man, Johnny. She knelt beside him, gently touching his broken mask. "You messed up, Johnny. Don't worry, I'll fix it." Johnny, still reeling from Max's attack, nodded weakly. "Get me out of here, Em." Emily helped him to his feet, and together they made their way to the door. But before they could leave, Alex, who had regained some of his strength, lunged at Johnny with a primal scream. The knife plunged into Johnny's side, but it wasn't enough to stop him. With a grunt, Johnny knocked Alex to the ground and delivered a vicious kick to his ribs. "Stay down, kid," Johnny growled, clutching his side as he and Emily disappeared into the storm. Mr. Thompson rushed to Alex's side, his heart pounding in his chest. Alex was bleeding badly, but he was alive. "Alex, hang on," Mr. Thompson whispered, pressing his hands against the wound to stop the bleeding. "You're going to be okay. We'll get through this." But as the storm continued to rage outside, and with Max unconscious and the killers on the loose, Mr. Thompson knew that things were far from okay. The nightmare wasn't over, not by a long shot. Chapter 12. The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. Max's eyes fluttered open, his head throbbing with pain. For a moment, he was disoriented, the events that had just transpired a blur in his mind. But as he slowly pushed himself up from the cold wooden floor, the memories came rushing back. Emily's betrayal, Johnny's mocking grin, and the searing pain in his back. He reached behind him, feeling the sticky warmth of his own blood. The wound wasn't deep enough to be fatal, but it was enough to weaken him. Max gritted his teeth, pushing the pain aside. He couldn't afford to be weak right now. Not when they were still out there. Max scanned the room, his eyes locking onto the bow and arrows scattered across the floor. The weapon was a lifeline, a tool he'd become proficient with during countless archery sessions. Slowly he got to his feet, the world spinning slightly as he steadied himself. His hands trembled, but his resolve was solid as stone. He wasn't just going to survive this nightmare, he was going to end it. Max retrieved the bow, checking the string for any damage before picking up the remaining arrows. There weren't many left, but they would have to do. He also grabbed the knife that had slipped from Emily's hand during the chaos. It was stained with his blood, and just holding it fueled his determination. This was no longer about survival. This was about vengeance. As Max moved through the dimly lit lounge, his steps were cautious but determined. Storm still raged outside, the wind howling like a chorus of lost souls. Every shadow seemed to flicker with menace, but Max wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Fear had been replaced by something far more dangerous. Pure, unbridled rage. He reached the door, pausing to listen for any sign of movement outside. The storm's roar made it difficult to hear anything else. But Max's instincts told him Johnny and Emily hadn't gone far. They wouldn't leave unfinished business behind, not when they were so close to whatever twisted goal they had in mind. Max pushed the door open and stepped out into the night. The rain was a relentless torrent, soaking him to the bone almost instantly. But he welcomed it, letting the cold water sharpen his senses. His eyes scanned the surroundings, looking for any sign of movement. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a faint light flickering in one of the other cabins. It was distant, but unmistakable. They were there. Max's grip on the bow tightened as he began his silent approach, his footsteps barely audible over the storm's din. As he neared the cabin, Max could make out the low murmur of voices, Johnny and Emily, their tones hushed but unmistakably smug. Crept closer, his breath slow and measured. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing his singular purpose, make them pay. Max took cover behind a large tree near the cabin, peering through the rain to see the two of them inside. Johnny was hunched over, still nursing the wounds Max had inflicted on him, while Emily paced the room, her knife in hand. "This isn't how it was supposed to go," Johnny muttered, wincing as he adjusted his bandages. Relax, Emily replied, her voice cool and detached. We still have the upper hand. They're scared, disoriented. We just need to finish the job. Max's blood boiled at the sound of her voice. How could someone who had shared their fears, their laughter, turn so cold, so monstrous? He shook his head, clearing his thoughts. This wasn't the time for questions. It was the time for action. Drawing an arrow, Max took aim through the cracked window of the cabin. Focused on Johnny, his finger brushing the bowstring. The storm made the shot difficult, but Max's determination steadied his hand. With a deep breath, he released the arrow, flew through the air with a quiet whir, striking Johnny in the shoulder. He let out a roar of pain, the force of the impact knocking him off balance. Emily spun around, her eyes wide with shock as she looked out into the storm, trying to spot their unseen attacker. Max didn't give her a chance to react. He knocked another arrow and fired again, this time hitting Johnny in the leg. The man crumpled to the ground, cursing as he tried to reach for his gun. Pain was too much. He could barely move. Emily's gaze zeroed in on Max's location, her eyes narrowing as she realized who it was. Max, she hissed, stepping forward with the knife raised. Max emerged from behind the tree, his bow still aimed at her. It's over, Emily. You won't hurt anyone else. She smiled, a wicked grin that sent a chill down Max's spine. You think you've won, Max? You think you can stop us? We're just getting started. Max fired another arrow, this time at Emily, but she dodged, the arrow embedding itself in the wooden wall behind her. She lunged forward, the knife glinting in the faint light. Max dropped the bow and met her charge head-on, their bodies colliding with a force that sent them both tumbling to the ground. They grappled in the mud, each trying to gain the upper hand. Emily was fast, but Max was fueled by something deeper, something primal. He managed to twist the knife out of her hand and throw it aside, his fists connecting with her face in a flurry of strikes. She spat blood, laughing through the pain. You're just like us, Max. You enjoy this, don't you? Max didn't respond, his only focus on subduing her. He was done with words. Finally, he pinned her to the ground, his hands wrapped around her throat. Emily's laughter faded as she struggled to breathe, her eyes widening in panic. Max's grip tightened, but before he could finish her, a sharp pain exploded in his side. He gasped, loosening his hold as he looked down to see Johnny, having dragged himself to where they fought, his knife buried in Max's side. The pain was excruciating. Max refused to let go of Emily. With a primal scream, Max ripped the knife from his side and drove it into Johnny's chest. The man's eyes widened in shock before the life drained from them, his body going limp. Max turned his attention back to Emily, but she had already taken advantage of the distraction, slipping free from his grasp. Johnny, she screamed, rushing to his side, but it was too late. Johnny was dead. Max, bleeding and exhausted, staggered to his feet, ready to end this nightmare. But before he could strike, Emily stood, her eyes filled with a mix of rage and grief. You'll pay for this, Max, she spat, backing away towards the door. You'll pay with your life. She turned and fled into the storm, leaving Max standing in the doorway, bloodied and battered, but alive. He let out a shaky breath, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. Johnny was dead, but Emily was still out there, still dangerous. Max knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But as he looked down at Johnny's lifeless body, he felt a grim satisfaction. One threat had been eliminated, and he had a new resolve. He would find Emily, and he would finish what he started. With that thought in mind, Max grabbed his bow, slung the quiver over his shoulder, and began the hunt. Chapter 13. A story to be remembered. Emily ran through the forest, branches slashing at her face and arms as she stumbled over roots and rocks. The storm had reduced the world to a blur of darkness and rain. She didn't dare slow down. Not with Max hunting her. Not with Johnny dead. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each step fueled by a mix of fear and fury. How had it all gone so wrong? She had planned everything down to the smallest detail. This was supposed to be her masterpiece, the story that would finally make her visible to the world. She was tired of being the invisible girl, the one nobody noticed, the one whose voice was drowned out by the noise of others. She was tired of being nobody. Emily's thoughts drifted back to her high school years, the countless days spent in the background, watching as others lived their lives while she remained on the sidelines. She had always been the quiet one, the observer, the girl with her nose buried in a book or scribbling stories in her notebook. But no one cared about her stories. No one saw her. Until one night, as she lay in bed, the glow of her laptop casting eerie shadows on the walls, she stumbled across an old 80s slasher film. The plot was simple, the killer relentless, and the victims unremarkable. But the idea took root in her mind. An urban legend, a real one, something that would grip the world's imagination. She could create a story that people wouldn't just read, they would live it, fear it, remember it. Emily's pace slowed as she recalled the moment of clarity she'd had, the thrill of knowing she had finally found a way to be seen. She would be the sole survivor, key witness, the one who lived to tell the tale. And the best part? She wouldn't be the one killing. That would make her innocent in the eyes of the law. Ultimate victim turned hero. But then Max had to go and ruin everything. Fucking Max! She spat under her breath, wiping the rain from her face. She had underestimated him. She thought he'd be easy to manipulate, like the others. But he was different. There was a darkness in him that she hadn't seen coming, a rage that matched her own in intensity. And now, because of him, Johnny was dead. Johnny. She had met him on the dark corners of the web, in forums where the disillusioned and the disturbed gathered to share their twisted fantasies. She had been cautious at first, testing the waters, but when she found Johnny, she knew she had struck gold. He was as committed to their art as she was, willing to do whatever it took to make their vision a reality. Together, they had crafted the story of the wolf mask killer, an unstoppable force of nature that would leave a trail of bodies and a legacy of fear. Johnny had even taken on the role with relish, embodying the character in ways that had exceeded Emily's expectation. Now, he was gone. She paused, leaning against a tree to catch her breath, her mind racing. How had it come to this? She had to find a way to salvage the situation, to turn it all around. She couldn't let Max win, not when she was so close to achieving everything she'd ever wanted. But what could she do? She was out of allies, out of options. Max was relentless, and he wasn't going to stop until he had her blood on his hands. She needed a new plan, something that would turn the tables in her favor. Her thoughts whirled, searching for a solution, a way to regain control. Maybe she could lure Max into a trap, use his anger against him. He was blinded by his need for revenge. Maybe she could exploit that. Yes, that could work. She just needed to think clearly, stay one step ahead. She couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. Emily straightened, a new resolve hardening in her chest. She wasn't going to die here. Not in these woods. Not tonight. She had come too far to let it end like this. She would find a way to win, to finish her story the way it was meant to be. As she started moving again, her mind raced with possibilities, each one more dangerous than the last. She would find a way to make Max pay for what he'd done. And when it was all over, when the dust had settled, she would be the one telling the tale, her name etched into the annals of urban legend. Max had turned the game around on her once, but she wouldn't let it happen again. This was her story, and she was going to finish it, no matter what it took. Chapter 14, A Predator. His senses sharpened by the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, the storm's fury beginning to wane. But the darkness still pressed in around him, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning. His grip tightened on the bow, his mind focused on one thing, finding Emily. She had taken everything from him. Lisa was gone, Mr. Thomas was hurt, Alex was barely clinging to life. Max's thoughts swirled with anger, guilt, and a need for revenge. He wasn't going to let Emily get away with it. Not after all she'd done. But Emily was smart, and Max knew she was somewhere close, waiting for her moment to strike. Could feel her presence, like a shadow lurking just beyond his vision. She was watching him, planning her next move. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Max spotted something. Faint glimmer in the dark. He turned, his eyes narrowing as he approached. It was a piece of metal, partially buried in the mud, reflecting the light from his flashlight. He crouched down, reaching for it, when suddenly the ground gave way beneath him. He fell into a pit, the earth closing around him with a thud. He hit the bottom hard, The wind knocked out of him as the bow clattered to the side. Pain shot through his body as he tried to stand, realizing too late that he had walked right into Emily's trap. "Gotcha!" Emily's voice echoed from above, smug and triumphant. Max gritted his teeth, his anger flaring. He should have known. He should have been more careful. "I thought you were smarter than that, Max," Emily taunted, her figure silhouetted against the dim light filtering through the trees. "But I guess you're just as predictable as the rest of them." Max didn't respond. His eyes scanned the pit, looking for a way out, his mind racing. He wasn't going to die here. Not like this. "I wonder what your mom would think," Emily continued, circling the pit like a vulture. "You've caused so much pain, Max. You're just like me, aren't you? Desperate to be seen, to make your mark on the world." Max's jaw tightened at the mention of his mother. That was low, even for Emily. He wouldn't let her get to him. Not now. Or maybe, Emily mused, her tone turning icy. "You're just scared. Scared that no matter what you do, you'll always be that scared little boy, lashing out because you can't handle the world around you." Max's vision turned red, a surge of anger giving him the strength he needed. He spotted a root protruding from the side of the pit, just within reach. Without a second thought, he grabbed it and began to climb, pulling himself up with every ounce of strength he had left. Emily's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. "No!" she shouted, lunging forward to stop him. But Max was quicker. He reached the edge of the pit and yanked her down, the two of them tumbling to the ground in a heap. They wrestled in the mud, each one fighting for control. Emily slashed at him with a knife, but Max grabbed her wrist, twisting until she dropped the blade. Fell between them, half buried in the mud, glinting menacingly. With a grunt, Max pinned Emily down, his hand closing around the knife. He raised it above her, ready to end it, but Emily's eyes locked onto his, defiant and unafraid. "Do it," she hissed, her voice laced with venom. "Show everyone who you really are." Max hesitated, the knife trembling in his hand. His mother's face flashed before his eyes, a kind smile, the warmth in her voice. She had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. The hesitation was all Emily needed. She reached up, grabbing his wrist, and twisted. The knife slipped from his grasp, but not before it sliced into her hand, embedding itself deep in the flesh. She cried out in pain, but the look in her eyes didn't change. She was still defiant, still taunting him. Max's breath came in ragged gasps as he fought the urge to end it, to finish what he'd started. But then, through the haze of rage, he heard a voice that cut through the chaos like a beacon. "Max, stop." He turned to see Mr. Thomas standing at the edge of the clearing, his face pale and drawn. He was soaked to the bone, clothes clinging to his frail frame, but his eyes were clear, pleading. "Max, you don't have to do this," Mr. Thomas said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Think about your mother. Think about what she would want." Max's grip on the knife loosened, his resolve wavering. He glanced back at Emily, who was clutching her bleeding hand, a sneer on her lips. "You're better than this," Mr. Thomas continued, stepping closer. "You don't have to become like her." Max's chest heaved as he struggled to regain control. He could end it all right here, right now, but what would that make him? Would he be any different from Emily, from Johnny? "Max, please," Mr. Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mom wouldn't want this." Max's vision cleared, the red haze lifting. He dropped the knife, letting it fall into the mud. Emily's sneer faded, replaced by a look of surprise. For a moment, she almost seemed disappointed. Then, from the distance, the sound of sirens filled the air, cutting through the rain and wind. Mr. Thomas glanced over his shoulder, relief flooding his face. "The state police are here," he said, looking back at Max. "And they found Lisa. She's alive, Max. She's going to be okay." Max stared at him, the weight of everything crashing down on him at once. He had come so close to losing himself, becoming everything he hated. But now, the police closing in, the nightmare was finally over. As the officers approached, Max stood, body trembling with exhaustion. Emily was on the ground, holding her hand, her eyes filled with a mix of hatred and fear. She knew it was over, too. Before the police reached them, she looked up at Max, a twisted smile curling her lips. "You almost had it, Max," he whispered, "but you'll never be able to escape who you really are." Max ignored her. turning to Mr. Thomas, who placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Max," he said softly. "Your mom would be proud." Max nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, thinking about everything that had happened, everything he had done. As the police moved in, he glanced back at Emily, who was being cuffed and led away. She looked over her shoulder at him, her eyes cold and calculating. And then he saw Lisa, being carried on a stretcher, her face pale but alive. Her eyes met his, and she gave him a weak, grateful smile. Max's heart swelled with relief, but also with something else: determination. This wasn't over. Not yet. As the paramedics loaded Lisa into the ambulance, Max turned to Mr. Thomas. "We need to get to the lounge," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not letting this end here." Mr. Thomas nodded, a look of pride in his eyes. "Let's go." As they walked toward the camp, the storm finally beginning to break, Max felt a strange sense of peace. He had faced the darkness and come out the other side, but he knew, deep down, that the real fight was just beginning. Thank you for joining us for Camp Nightmare on Survival Horror Ambiance. The darkness has claimed its victims, but the story doesn't end here. If you enjoyed this journey into terror, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let us know in the comments what you think will happen next, and don't forget to tune in for more tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Until next time, remember, survival is only the beginning.